This audio file is a production of the Divinity School, the graduate professional school for the academic study of religion at the University of Chicago. Visit us online at divinity.uchicago.edu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I know it's been a long day, the end of a long week, but we're grateful to have such a great crowd here. My name is Mary Emily, and with Aaron Hollander, I co-coordinate the Theology Workshop. This quarter, the Theology Workshop has been hosting a series of conversations around the theme of embodiment, sexuality, and religion. And we've heard lots of exciting presentations on things as wide-ranging as religion and the senses, to the theologies and practices of baptism, to conversations around feasting and fasting, and an upcoming conversation about representations of female sexuality in the Song of Songs. So it seemed fitting to us that when Brandon Klein asked if we would prepare a pedagogy session on behalf of the Theology Workshop, that we would focus on the theme of embodiment. So we have invited three of our own faculty members, Professors Culp, Stackert, and Lindner, to reflect on their own experiences and best practices for creating classroom cultures and environments that intentionally honor the body as a constitutive part of human being and knowing and learning. So we have asked our panelists to reflect on questions such as, and we've left this sort of open to them, we sort of gave them a few questions to sort of get their own thoughts going, but we suggested to them to reflect on how teachers can use their own embodied presences in the classroom and the embodied presences of their students to deepen and inflect learning. What kinds of pedagogical practices work to unveil and dismantle oppressions in the classroom that silence or privilege certain embodied experiences? And how existing structures with which bodies may be at odds, such as physical space or institutional culture, can be shifted, challenged, or named in order to create an academic space where bodies are not something to be overcome or sidelined, but held in integrity with all dimensions of life, of the life of scholarly inquiry. So we will begin this afternoon by inviting each of our panelists to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation to the room and invite your own questions for the panelists, as well as your own insights or best practices, if you have them, on the theme of embodiment and pedagogy. So with that, help me welcome our panelists. They have predetermined their own order.
So I've been designated as the first speaker. I want to say thank you to Mary Emily and to Aaron for the invitation to speak with you today, also to Professor Hopkins and to Professor Otten, who are faculty sponsors of the Theology Workshop. I'd like to talk briefly about two main topics related to embodiment this afternoon. One is gender, the other is disability. But before doing so, I'd like to briefly make a theoretical case for the importance of the body for religious studies. To do so, I will draw from the work of two important Divinity School thinkers. First is our recently retired colleague Martin Riesebrot. In his recent volume, The Promise of Salvation, A Theory of Religion, Riesebrot defines religion thusly. He says, quote, "Religion is a complex of practices that are based on the premise of the existence of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, that are generally invisible. The superhumanness of these powers consists in the fact that influence or control over dimensions of individual or social human life and the natural environment is attributed to them, dimensions that are usually beyond direct human control." End quote. What I am especially struck by in this definition, and what I think also makes it particularly apt for our discussion of embodiment, is its fundamental human-centeredness. Riesebrot does not define the powers that are the focus of religion as supernatural. They are instead superhuman. These powers exert control over dimensions of the world that are beyond human control, he says. In such a carefully crafted definition, Riesebrot underscores the fundamentally human nature of religion itself. Though it oftentimes addresses features of the world and beyond that are undeniably non-human, it does so consistently with an eye toward their importance to an impact upon humans. If Riesebrot is right in this understanding of religion, and I think that he is, then the bodies of humans, which are their fundament in the world and integral to the practices of religion, are of primary importance. The second thinker I'd like to highlight is Catherine Bell. In her theorization of ritual, in her volume Ritual Theory, Ritual Practice, Bell, drawing especially on Bourdieu, lays out the purpose of ritual, or as she prefers to call it, ritualization. She states, quote, "The implicit dynamic and end of ritualization, that which it does not see itself doing, can be said to be the production of a ritualized body. A ritualized body is a body invested with a sense of ritual. Ritualization produces this ritualized body through the interaction of the body with a structured and structuring environment. Through a series of physical movements, ritual practices spatially and temporally construct an environment organized according to schemes of privileged opposition. The construction of this environment and the activities within it simultaneously work to impress these schemes upon the bodies of participants." End quote. In other words, for Bell, religious practice, all of which she would generally include under the rubric of ritualization, is fundamentally embodied and has its primary effect on the body, even if not recognized as such by religious practitioners. The body, of course, includes the mind, but Bell rightly emphasizes, as observation of religion demonstrates, that religious practices are not simply thoughts. They are actions, human actions, performed by bodies. Now, you might already be asking, what does this have to do with bodies in the classroom? I would say everything. That is, if our subject is religion, its fundamental embodiedness, both in practice and thought, in performance and text, invite us as scholars investigating religion to make embodied identifications with it. In other words, the language and practices of the body in religion correlate with, both directly and inversely, our own embodied experiences. But otherwise, when we think arms and legs, we think our own arms and legs. Let me turn now to the ways that this plays out in my own classroom. Most broadly, I am a scholar of ancient Near Eastern religions. I focus mainly on the Hebrew Bible and Israelite religion, but I do so with a strong comparative interest in Israel's wider ancient Near Eastern cultural milieu. There are bodies, imaginations of bodies, embodied practices, bodily functions, and other issues related to bodies all over the material that I study and teach. And this includes both human and divine bodies, which were modeled in the ancient Near East quite directly on human bodies. With such foci, these texts quite naturally invite embodied identifications with them. Yet this is precisely where things begin to get tricky. For in the midst of our common human embodied experience, there are also differences, sometimes significant differences among us. I said that I wanted to address the issues of gender and disability. Let me take up the topic of gender first, and I'll spend more time on gender than disability. To do so, I want to first tell you a somewhat embarrassing story related to the gender makeup of the courses that I taught last winter. During that term, I taught 2 courses. In one, there were 3 women and 1 man among the students. In the other, there were 12 men and 1 woman. Because my courses generally have a majority of men and a minority of women students in them, I was especially struck, and very pleasantly, by a course in which 75% of the students were women. It was very noticeable. In the other course, in which there were 12 men and 1 woman, however, it took me until week 3 or 4, I can't remember, to actually notice the disparity. I was pretty upset with myself for this, and tried to think through how I might have overlooked it. I suspect that there were at least 2 reasons, and maybe more than these. First, as I said, I'm accustomed to teaching courses with a gender imbalance. And second, the 1 woman in the class was an active participant and valuable contributor to discussion. Thus, the situation that I sometimes hear about, in which women who are outnumbered in class not speaking up, did not, as far as I could tell, really apply to this case. Nonetheless, it bothered me that I was initially tuned out to the 12-to-1 ratio of this course. When I finally noticed the gender disparity, I immediately went to the one-woman student and talked to her specifically about it and asked her if there was anything that I could do to improve the course for her. So if I were to point out best practices, maybe I would say here, admit your mistakes. Admit it if you don't see it and if you should have. But what I also want to emphasize, especially in light of my opening comments on the embodiedness of religion, is what I see as an impoverishment of the classroom in a case like this one. I can and do make observations about gender in my courses, both male and female gender. But if I always reflect, at least in part, my own knowledge, experience, and being, it is likely that I will oftentimes be better attuned to male gender than female gender. Moreover, because the texts that I study originate in male-dominated societies, women readers are oftentimes better attuned to these text strategies of patriarchy than men are. In my view, we need to ask questions about multiple issues and from multiple viewpoints, and to do so most effectively, in my experience, we need both women and men at the table. Let me say a few words about another gender issue in the classroom. It's one that arose in the course that I taught that had 3 women and 1 man, but I'll also give an example from another course in a woman. The course with 3 women and 1 man was primarily focused on the students' work and the presentation of it in class. And one student was writing on portrayals of women in Song of Songs and Proverbs. That student, we'll call her Kelly, wrote a fantastic paper on gender politics in these texts. Well, some of the content of the text that she was working on was quite erotic and, shall we say, embodied. It sometimes gets pretty graphic. Let me give you an example that I personally stumbled on a bit, and it's not nearly the most graphic part at all. Proverbs 5:19 through 20 state, "A loving doe, a graceful mountain goat, let her breast saturate you at all times. Be infatuated with love of her always. Why be infatuated, my son, with a forbidden woman? Why embrace the bosom of an alien woman?" These verses exhort a male audience to marital fidelity. Men are to be enthralled with their wives, according to these verses, and should not look elsewhere. These verses also follow upon verses that make an analogy between the man's wife and water. So we get lines like, "Drink water from your own well, it will gush forth for you alone." And so in her analysis of this text, Kelly focused on this water imagery. She focused especially in verse 19 on the verb to saturate. Let her breast saturate you at all times. And in line with the drinking imagery elsewhere in this and other similar passages, I suggested that she might here have a very concrete image, but it was in the very suggestion that I started to feel a little bit squeamish. That is, if this is describing a married couple in a pre-contraceptive age, chances are that she's having children and is thus lactating. And I made this comment to Kelly in writing and concluded it, quote, "You can see where I'm going here," end quote. But then we also had a conversation about it in class. And what I saw in this situation was that the best way to deal with issues of sexuality, issues of sexuality related to the body in particular, was simply to address them straight on, to have a really straightforward and open and honest conversation. A similarly potentially sensitive issue with regard to male bodies that shows up in courses that I teach from time to time is circumcision. And circumcision is a really interesting case, I think, especially in biblical priestly literature, because the argument about circumcision in Pentateuchal priestly literature is that we have within the Bible various views of circumcision. In Genesis 34, which belongs to the Elohistic source, circumcision is done because of the beauty of the circumcised penis. The claim is that the uncircumcised penis, the orla, the foreskin, is a cherpa. It's a reproach. It's an outrage it's as if the uncircumcised penis is gross. This is not the case in priestly literature. In priestly literature, the claim is that circumcision aids fertility. And this is something that we see much more broadly in anthropological data. This is not unique to the Israelites at all. But the claim is that the Israelite God looks down and sees Israelites having sex and notices the circumcised penis of the man, and that is a cognition sign for him. It reminds him to make that sexual congress fruitful. So the presumption of priestly literature is that sex produces babies, but in the case of the Israelites, God is giving them a special advantage. And so when he looks down on them and sees the circumcised penis, he knows, oh, that's one of them that I'm supposed to bless. And he zaps them with a special fertility blessing. Now, I have to admit, I'm much more comfortable talking about this than lactating breasts. But I actually taught a course, I think maybe I guess I taught a course in the fall where we talked about this some. And I taught it in room 400, which is right next to Cynthia's office.
I learned all kinds of good stuff.
I was projecting, holding forth one day. And Cynthia mentioned something to me about learning about circumcision. I guess her door was open. And I was all of a sudden self-conscious. But strikingly, and maybe one of the things that I appreciated about that course in the fall was that there were several women students in that class, and they were active participants on this topic. So there wasn't like a clamming up. If there was clamming up at all, maybe it was the male students. But in this case, like in the case of the course with the student I'm calling Kelly and her paper, I found that the best approach is to be really open and honest and to find ways to make the classroom as much as possible an opportunity for open exchange. I said to a couple of people before we started, I'm sure if Wendy Doniger were here, she would tell me that I was a prude, and we're worrying about that. But she might be right about me. But even if she is, I think there are students sometimes who are self-conscious about issues of sexuality and issues of bodies related to gender. And so even if I'm a prude here, I'm I guess holding a flag for sensitivity to these kinds of things in the classroom. And I guess the way that I see to best be sensitive is to just be really open and honest, to let everything be said, let everything be on the table, and take it really seriously. Now, before I close, I'd like to shift the discussion briefly to disabilities. I have now co-authored 2 articles with colleagues who have special expertise in disability studies. In the case of one of these scholars, this interest is related in part to his own disability. Though there is also an advocacy wing to disability studies, what both of my colleagues with whom I have written do is simply give special and historically informed attention to disability issues in the text that they study. And this is what we've done in the articles that we've written together. By simply paying attention to different issues that non-disabled scholars oftentimes overlook, we've been able to offer new and important insights about the Israelite religious imagination. And what I think is perhaps instructive about this, not unlike cases of gender, is that one isn't sort of locked into one's own body. I said at the beginning that this is where we obviously start from. But we're complicated, complex people, and we're able to think outside of our own skin, maybe not fully and fully successfully all the time. But I've been very much instructed by writing these articles with these colleagues and being turned on to issues in the text that just weren't on my radar before. And so I think the issue of diverse perspectives and multiple engagements with the text is extremely fruitful, and in both the cases of gender and disability, these are fundamentally related to the body. To sum up then, I would say it's my view that the body is a primary category for religious studies research and a primary lens through which we approach our work. I would advocate more conscious engagement of embodiment in our scholarship and the sometimes difficult work that attends such consideration in our classroom interactions. So I'll stop there.
I also want to begin by thanking the organizers of this and by noting that it is at least a little interesting that on Valentine's Day in the Divinity School, we're talking about embodiment. I want to actually begin with a couple of suspicions. And I don't think these are suspicions that are necessarily foreign to the way that our organizers formulated the topic for us, but I couldn't get into this without sort of voicing these. And one is about the conceptuality of embodiment itself to begin with. In some ways, it actually can serve to perpetuate a dualistic separation and hierarchical valuation of mind and body, that very separation and valuation that the language and the conceptuality of embodiment intends to overcome. Embodied contrasts to disembodied, and at least often implicitly to mind. And so using this language over and over in some ways actually inadvertently recreates and perpetuates this dualistic contrast of mind and body that it actually wants to dismantle. Furthermore, this mind-body dialectic is so pervasive that it sometimes nearly becomes rote in Christian theology, and it sometimes can function to flatten analysis, and it groups together really a bunch of different terms like pain and suffering, physicality, materiality, susceptibility to change. That's some of what I explore in my book, Vulnerability and Glory. That's trying to come up with some different categories to use. That's all my first suspicion. My second suspicion is with how embodiment often becomes more closely associated with certain bodies, with female, non-white, evidently non-heterosexual, infirm, aged, or physically less able bodies. And so the use of embodiment sometimes can sort of function as a sort of code to say, oh, those other than normal bodies. So I'm going to say that a focus on the point of attending to physical needs and processes in the context of teaching and learning, that ought to be the point, rather than this normative body or non-normative bodies. At the same time, we have to be aware that those dynamics are there and be aware of how that set of associations with certain bodies might affect teaching and learning. Okay, so suspicions, moving ahead from suspicions, I hoped I could craft something just sort of nice. Here's a 5-point way to talk about honoring the body in pedagogy. My friend Stephanie Paulsell has actually done some of that in her work on honoring the body in the context of religious practice, but I didn't quite get that far. But I do have kind of a series of points, and sometimes they flow more readily from one to the other than other times. The first point that I wanted to make, and you know, a lot of what I'm doing is I realize is a little bit up here, and I don't have all the stories to go with it, but I'm trying to think through this conceptuality in relation to how we think about teaching. First of all, just to affirm that thinking itself is a bodily process. We are often tempted in the academy or in everyday conversation to depict the most rarefied forms of intellection as disembodied, but I don't really think that's a very useful characterization. Thinking, reading, interpreting, comprehending, synthesizing, abstracting, et cetera, they're not disembodied processes. They are already bodily, physical processes. And I think here the vivid language of religious texts can actually be a resource for reminding us of that. For example, the psalmist writes, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Now, obviously that's first order discourse of a worshiping community, but still that sort of sensory analogy and others can serve to remind us of the range of processes of intellection and their rootedness in physical life and creaturely experience. Now, having said that, I think the question of whether there are certain forms of thought in themselves that may tend to become more disengaged from the devastations and glories of creaturely existence is another matter. But just kind of gauging how abstract or not those forms are is not going to answer the question of this disengagement. I was conversing by email with a good friend of mine who has an autoimmune disorder and has struggled a lot in the last couple of years. And she said, you know, my neurologist told me that thinking is actually as taxing in terms of energy and use of oxygen as aerobic activity. I don't have a footnote for you on that other than my friend, but regardless of where it falls on any kind of gauge, attentive thinking itself is an arduous physiological process. And I think one way to think about the classroom space and class preparation is that those are spaces and times that are set aside for this most arduous physiological process. I don't know about you, but after I've taught a class, the adrenaline's going for a little bit, and then an hour out of that, I just make sure I don't make any important decisions. And my friend who's struggled with autoimmune disorder reminded me that if one is ill or overstressed, especially traumatically injured, one of the hardest things to do is to have the physical capacity to think or learn well. I think that has all kinds of ramifications for the broader community of learning. What kind of stress is in the air? What are we doing to make sure that we have these focused spaces for the physical activity of thinking hard together? The other thing, I haven't thought through this as well, but correlatively, I think the experience of thinking clearly sometimes can come as a relief if there are other things that are stressing, distracting, and that ability to be in a classroom and to think hard about something comes as a different sort of reminder of the tough physiological work of attentive thinking. One of my hesitations of agreeing to serve on this panel was when I thought about my classroom teaching, I wasn't sure how exemplary it was of this attending well to the range of human experience. What I was reminded of is that teaching and learning don't only occur in the classroom either. I mean, I think there's more to be said about the classroom, but when I first started teaching, I was amazed at how much I enjoyed working on committees. I was at a freestanding seminary, not here. I see our deans cringing back there, smiling, or one or the other. And I'm on a bunch of committees as well. And I think that's important to remember, that faculty and deans teach through the broader environment and not only in the classroom. And honestly, that's one of the delights of being dean of the Disciples Divinity House, is that's a teaching space and environment to occupy as well, in which the tables of learning in the library are interrelated to the tables of eating together in the dining hall, and in that case also the table of communion in the chapel. And that kind of flow amongst those different ways of gathering persons together provides a lot more opportunities for how you think about pedagogies for the whole person. So in case you weren't looking forward to serving on committees, there's one more reason why you might be. Okay, so I was then thinking about if we don't want to necessarily use this language of honoring the body as the best way to talk about what we're doing in the classroom, what other language? And a couple of things that I was reminded of that have been important for me. One is a phrase by Howard Thurman, and he refers to the fact of a person. And another is Simone de Beauvoir's work on the situation of a person and the situatedness of a person, and the body as being a situation. Let me say something first about Howard Thurman. For Thurman, the phrase, the fact of a person, encompass not only something like the embodied presence of a person, which is in our description for this event, but it also involved a sense of what a person had undergone and what the person might yet become. I think the work of the classroom isn't knowing the fact of a person per se. I mean, we're not studying each other in that direct sense. But nevertheless, it provides some gracious moments of being able to, in a kind of sideways glance, as it were, recognize or begin to recognize and glimpse the fact of a person. I think advising actually even takes that up more directly. One of, I think, the most important things that we can do in this pedagogy of attending to the whole person is acknowledging the individual facts of class members. And that starts with simple things like recognizing them, knowing their names. I had the opportunity to see the exhibit that's now at the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C. of the Chinese dissident Ai Weiwei's work. And there's a great quote that's part of that exhibit. He writes, "A name is the most basic characteristic of our human rights. No matter how poor or how rich, all living people have a name, and it is endowed with good wishes, the expectant blessings of kindness and virtue. part of his art is to have a wall of names of the Chinese school children who were killed in the horrible building failure in the Sichuan earthquake. But I think in the same way, knowing the names of our students who are in our classes, coming to know some of the particularity about that, and having some ways of recognizing, oh, I know I recognize that bent of mind. I know some of the habits of the ways that you enter into conversation. I think that's really important work. And I think Howard Thurman's phrase, the fact of a person helps, is one way of sort of acknowledging that dimension of classroom work. And then Beauvoir, I actually even brought in my Beauvoir text. She has two really helpful things to say about reconceptualizing the body. And one is to view the body as part of the situatedness of being human. That's probably the most famous aspect of her thought on that. But there's another piece of her thought. She uses this image of how physical existence is the general background of personhood, and that the person, as it were, stands out in relief from that general background. The verb that she uses is related to sculptural relief. So if you think of a flat piece of, some sculptural, motif, and how the foreground pops out from the background. Her image there suggests that at some times, in order to ask the most basic questions of self and world, the background first has to stand out, and that's the case for her book. And I think that's sometimes the case in the classroom. For Beauvoir to ask the question, what is a woman? She first had to start by saying, I am a woman, and then proceeding to unfold what that subject position meant for knowing. She implicitly acknowledges, and I would also affirm, that that's not always the happiest way to have to proceed in a conversation. That lots of times you just want to be in the foreground and ask the important question about what it means to be a self, what's going on in the world, without having to say, I am something or another first and foremost. And I think that's some of the task that we have to keep navigating in the classroom, is when is it important to allow that background to come out in the posing of these huge questions that we want to explore together, and when and how do you create the space that background recedes and the foreground questions are able to be asked on their own. I know that's framing that a little bit abstractly, but I think that the ability to ask those questions changes in different types of classroom settings, the ability to, the necessity of paying attention to those background questions, the fruitfulness of paying attention to those background questions as the context for these bigger questions shifts. I'm going to quit there and pass it on to Cynthia.
I would add my thanks to those of my colleagues for an invitation to think about something that, as I actually set aside some time during the week to think about it, I realized that what you had done by asking us to think about creating environments that honor the body as constitutive of human being knowing and learning, that's like how I breathe, right? That's what I do. It felt like I was having to pay attention to my breathing, or to my heart rate, or to something that is so essential to how I roll. So thank you for that. It was a good exercise for me. The very existence, I think, of an MDiv program, a professional program for the cultivation of religious leaders and practitioners in the context of an institution devoted to the academic study of religion, that in itself, this project we're all engaged in together, I think, is an everyday and all the time project of creating space in our discourse for embodied wisdom and practical knowledge, textual knowledge, body knowledge to all come together. And creating the space too in our classrooms and curriculum and our extracurricular life together for religious bodies, not just not the ideas on the page. I understand those are embodied too, but people whose bodies and experiences and identities are implicated and conformed and comported by these ideas. These folks too come to the table at this place as full participants in our common life of scholarly inquiry. So I think this place, very deep in the structure of this divinity school, is an old but still kind of bold subversion of the disembodiment that culture pushes. I think this place has different bones and is trying to do a different thing. And as I thought about our practice here, I realized that every occasion of our coming together in classrooms, a Wednesday lunch, in your extracurricular activities, in Wednesday worship, is an opportunity for making this constitutive integrity real again, and operating as though it exists, even in the gaps where it doesn't quite yet exist. When I think about how I do this, I realize I don't do any of it on my own. As many of you know, I'm technically what is called in some parts of the university a clinical professor. And that means that what I bring to the Divinity School or the ministry program or the classroom, I bring in part from a life of practice. The practice of pastoral leadership for 20 years, the practice of pastoral psychotherapy also for almost 20 years now. Practices that have to, by definition, engage bodies pretty overtly. Our own bodies and the bodies of others. I am, of course, as all of us in this room are, indebted to texts, the classics that have shaped my thought and practice, but I am also indebted, I think, to what some of people in my profession call living documents, mentors and congregants and patients for what I've come to know. And every day in my work in this place, I'm still being instructed by these people and their stories and their lessons. So I think that I want to thematize story and living document and collaboration. And maybe tell you a story, because that's what I do. So my introduction to the terrifying reality of bodies' wisdom was enacted across Ellis Avenue at the University Hospital during the summer of 1979, after my first year in what was then just the master's program here. I was a student chaplain. It was my very first night on call at the University Hospital, which meant that I got to hold the pager all by myself while all the real chaplains went home. And so about 2 a.m. I responded to a call from the emergency room nurse to come and attend to a 70-year-old woman who had just learned that her husband of 50 years, they'd been married 50 years, had died of a massive heart attack that had struck just sort of out of the blue. He had just died an hour earlier. If I had been paying attention to the wave of anxiety and nausea that flooded my body sympathetically as I approached the ER through the empty pre-dawn hospital hallways, I could have spared this woman and I both a lot of aggravation. But instead I composed myself. Think about that word. That term, compose myself, that was a telling phrase. I opened the door to the private consultation room where, the side of the ER where they usually sequestered grieving family members, and still standing in the doorway of the room, I introduced myself to a small woman who was pressed against the far wall with her body tense and her head down low and her eyes on the floor, like dodging any more bad news. I had on a white hospital lab coat. I was really proud of that. And a hospital badge. And I assumed the dispassionate, yet sort of solicitous tone that they taught chaplains in the 1970s. And I recited the script. There was a script. Hello, Mrs. Jones. I'm the chaplain on duty tonight. Pause. You're supposed to count to 5. How are you feeling? For a moment, there was no response at all. Head still bowed, body still tense, not a movement, not a word. I was kind of concerned. Maybe Mrs. Jones was going to be too stricken by her grief to say anything or even to hear me or to respond. But I didn't need to worry about that. In the next split second, Mrs. Jones grabbed the worn copy of the physician's desk reference, which is about 3 times this size, from the table next to her. She was a frail old woman. It was a sizable book, hardbound. She hurled it with incredible force and expert aim, and she hit her mark right between my eyes. There is this divot I have right here. You think it's an old age scowl? This is Mrs. Jones, summer of 1979. My ears were already ringing and my head was already pounding, but I could still hear her loud and clear. And Mrs. Jones said to me, "How do you feel, chaplain?" I've never forgotten that lesson of my very first pastoral encounter. And the lesson really was pay attention to bodies. My body was trying to tell me something going down the hallway. I knew what she felt. I didn't have to ask. Pay attention to bodies. Listen to your body's wisdom. Honor it in yourself so that you can honor it in others. So paying attention to bodies, our own and the bodies of others, means several things, I think, in the classroom and in the collective life of a place like this. It means cultivating space, I think. For me, really practically, upstairs, it means that we organize our MDiv program by cohort. That means small groups of students who proceed through the program together, in part so that they can learn each other's stories, and when they're at their best, and the MDivs here will tell you that's not always in the life of a cohort, you're not always at your best. But when they're at their best, they can inscribe that safe space, holding environment for these authentic and complicated accounts of our own experiences as bodies who study and practice and reflect on our practices. Many cohort classes take place in the same physical space, not by design really, but by assignment and happy accident. And over time, that holding environment has extended beyond the room 400 classroom with the table, that large table that we can all fit around, to the surrounding suite with its couches and its teapot and the snacks on the shelf that you have all found by now. All of which are there to sort of invite students to appear, right? To establish yourselves, to take up space, to take up space, to take up space, to inhabit your learning more comfortably, and to maybe inhabit your comfort more thoughtfully. Each of the cohort courses in that program engage students in some aspect of leadership arts. All of the leadership arts involve some performance, right? Some embodied performance, all of which we practice in the classroom or in the chapel or in the surrounding room since we've taught. Take, for example, a preaching and worship class Professor Otten and I teach, along with practitioners and PhD students. Something else to say about what's important to me about teaching teaching that attends to body's wisdom. I don't teach by myself anymore, or I very rarely do. I teach in teams. I try very hard, but that team is not only white women. The team that is teaching pastoral care with me this quarter is a gay Presbyterian pastor and a Korean student in theology. If we're teaching practices, especially arts, I think it's important that the arts don't all look like one of us. Collaboration. In the preaching and worship class, we learned that communication, if you listen to communication theorists, 60% of the preaching act is about the body's communication, not about the words that we write, so we spend a lot of time on it, but about the body's communication. So we practice. We practice embodying the words. We practice inhabiting the bodies that listen to the words. We imagine how those words are heard and apprehended by the bodies that hear them. In pastoral care class too, we have to do more than study and theorize the human condition and the causes of suffering and the technologies of healing. Students are asked to interrogate their own experience, and they do so pretty courageously. What do we know? What does your body know about suffering? What does your body know about healing? Because we have experienced these things. Students are also asked to role play. Role as in R-O-L-E. I kind of often think of it also as R-O-L-L because rolling eyes is how it starts. If you can imagine that asking students in a place like this to inhabit roles is an easy thing to do, it's not. But I ask them to role play the roles of care seeker and caregiver with their bodies. To practice theological reflection as it happens in the moment with your body. Not to rehearse a script like I did many years ago in that hospital hallway, but to learn how our bodies themselves help us read a situation. Now the reactions in our bodies are telling us something. And the something that they're telling us is not just about ourselves. The reactions in our bodies are telling us what's happening in this room. What is somebody else experiencing? And then to experience in our bodies what it feels like to move between experience and reflection as we improvise a response without leaving our bodies. There's a lot of initial resistance to these activities, right? You know what it's like to write a paper and then turn it in sort of anonymously to the professor. Now imagine composing those words and then standing up in front of your classmates and then speaking them, your body's on the line in a way there's lots of resistance at first to doing that. There's resistance to paying attention to our performance. Is it somehow unfaithful or unacademic or theatrical or manipulative or just naive? Is it impossible in pastoral care to imagine and role play and inhabit somebody else's pain? There is, I think, and lives in our learning community, but also among thoughtful people in our time and place, an inherent distrust of our bodies as teachers, our bodies as communicators, our bodies as thinkers, our bodies as healers. And there is a fear of communication that is both embodied and immediate. That discomfort pushes back at me as a teacher. I sit in the classroom sometimes and would like to duck that. Sometimes I extend the conversation a little longer because I don't want to see the students squirm in that pastoral care role play. We could talk about the texts a little bit longer. Save them the suffering and save me the suffering of watching them. Our anxiety pushes back. But when it does, when I'm tempted to put the lab coat back on and return to the script, I remember Mrs. Jones, and maybe even I rubbed the divot in my forehead, and I'm drawn again to say, come back to your body. Remember, feel where it's anxious, feel where it's afraid. In pastoral care, we have another word for that, or I do. I'm an Oregonian. Are there Oregonians in the room? People who grew up in the woods near deer. When the deer jumps out in front of your car, what do? You turn toward the deer, right? There's a driving principle in the woods, and because I had to teach my kids to all drive there. The principle is if the deer comes across your car and you try to avoid it, then what happens is the deer inevitably collides with your windshield. That's not good for the deer, it's not good for you, it's not good for the windshield. If you drive towards the deer, sometimes this little interchange can take place and it'll skirt right in front of you. Driving toward the deer for me means when you feel the anxiety, when you feel the fear, when you feel the prickle, go there. When you feel the awkward question, when you feel the awkwardness of having to sort of position ourselves in the classroom, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, go there. Go to the awkward place. I think that's the body's wisdom for the in-between time. So, maybe I'll stop there. Because Olivia's time
Well, many thanks to our panelists, and we'd like to take this time to open it up to all of you to ask your questions of them, but we're also just to share experiences or best practices that you have or have experienced or wondered about trying.
Or to push back.
Or to push back, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. And I have a question specifically about teaching about forms and practices of embodiment to undergraduate students. I'm a TA in the college, and I was a TA for a class, introductory class in Greek philosophy in the fall. And as Professor Stackert was talking, I couldn't sort of stop but thinking that talking to graduate students about circumcision is quite different than in my experience talking to first-year college student about some moments in Greek philosophical texts where I saw some non-quite academic excitement about certain issues and perhaps quite non-academic reactions. So I wonder if you have any advice how to navigate that.
I think you get the opportunity to model for them what it means to look at the significance of the text without tittering about it. And I think that's really important. I don't know, that's just one.
I'd be tempted to drive toward the deer. Like, you're excited, how come? I mean, that's just me. But yes, to model the seriousness of the text, but also to acknowledge that where that starts in our body is that other place, right? You're uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think I'm willing, to acknowledge it as well and say, okay, I understand completely. Like I taught a couple years ago. The college has this study abroad program, and so I taught this course. It's somewhat, I guess, conceited model. They send the students and the faculty to places all over the world, and the students are taught then by Chicago faculty in some other location. But I was teaching Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel has this vision of God, and he's got like fire shooting out of his pants. And you can imagine what 19-year-old boys are doing with this. And So, I understand, this is a funny thing. I said, but, there's also, and so I feel like it's oftentimes worth naming it and acknowledging that this is very distant from us culturally, and that, people have a certain prurience to the way that they think, and sort of naming it as such, and going further than that and saying, well, it's not just a punchline, and going further. So, but no, I think, this happens all the time, and it happens less with graduate students. They tend to be more afraid of the fact
I have a question, and it's for all of you actually. Thank you so much for sharing what you're talking about tittering, right? And it's like even talking so-called objectively about the body as if that were possible is a challenge. So I thank you guys for taking that on for our sakes, and maybe not my help, but definitely for ours. My question came out of Dean Culp, what you were talking about with Beauvoir and the foreground and the background. And this is when you were talking about this being in relief, and sort of unfortunate nature of having to deal with the background and lead with the background, as it were, in order to get to the thing that is foregrounded, right, that is being weighed down by the background. And it triggered, in my mind, a lot of my recent thoughts around embodiment, and I agree with your analysis of the word as troubling, right? Is it becoming a ghettoization tool, such that any thinker that talks about embodiment, any thinker that talks about identity politics, as if identity politics was not universal to the socialized human, but the trappings of marginalization, right, as a side effect of marginalization, which is never critiqued as being wrongfully done, right? So part of your identity then becomes marked by, oh, we are the people who talk about embodiment. Yeah, okay, well, we can have a couple of those, just like we kind of Fabergé egg or something, some useless object. But my own thinking around background, and I think as a result of the critique that you were raising, has been, why is it that the background is background? I found that in a lot of my courses, I have, sort of the way that I encounter a text, the way that I analyze a text, and the types of questions I ask of the text are laced with my background. And I'm using that metaphorically, but to me, in my embodiment, I am brown, I am a woman, I have had, and you spoke too, I think all of you have spoken about the experiences that the student has outside of the classroom as well as inside the classroom. And so I'm always I wonder about our push to get to a foreground, which in my own experience is inferior, is a sort of abstraction of myself. And I might even be more radical than you are about mind and body. I also have an autoimmune disease, and you are 100% right. I corroborate your findings on that. What we're doing right here, I would be much less tired if I ran like a mile. So yes, that is definitely true, and I appreciate that pastoral care, like giving us that pastoral care mindset in the classroom. This is hard work. But yeah, I wondered if you all could talk about that, right? Because a lot of the anxiety that I feel, right? I am a very I feel things in my body, and so I have no trouble talking to groups of people because you can just look at what their bodies are doing and then you just like change course, depending on what's happening. But that anxiety, that is the anxiety of not wanting to deal with the fact that the background is significant, and not wanting to even talk about the background as being on equal terms, right? Those equal terms where everyone is embodied. How do you see us, I don't know if you've had experiences in your classroom, or how do you see us as, becoming educators, driving toward that, driving toward that deer, which is the deer of, we don't want to have a background, like having a background or having to lead with it is unfortunate. Where some of us, all we do is look at the back, all I do is look at the background. And so my thinking, my writing, my everything is background. There is no separation from those two. So,
let me just first give the sort of Beauvoir answer, because I knew that, doing that, it's doing really quickly what goes on. Part of her reason for she's layering this situation and situatedness and this image of the relief of foreground, background, and part of her claiming that the body is the background to everything is that it's not social construction all the way down. It's that we are always, bodies are the kind of basis on which, for Beauvoir, the rest of our existence comes into shape. And so I was trying to play with the partly, when she opens the book, it's this awareness that she can't have a conversation unless she starts with the background. But I think the way that the broader argument works is that there are times when that is the most significant piece, and that the point isn't to get to the foreground, it's that there isn't a self without the whole thing. There's probably better images than foreground, background, but for me that kind of, being able to choose to see things more than one way, and not to privilege the foreground or denigrate the background, but to see it as a whole. I don't know. I don't want to. I'm trying to be fair to Mom without. So I don't know. You can elaborate some. I think she uses both of those, and I think trying to get out this very complicated sense of we're shaped out of this situation, and that's always part of who we are, but it's not all of who we are. And I don't want to say that the foreground is better than the background, but that everybody ought to have the ability to only speak about the foreground if they want to only speak about the foreground, and that everybody has a background of some sort. And that's part of the issue, is how do you create spaces where you can talk about either one can lead, because they're both connected always. And that sounds very abstract.
I'm thinking about, and maybe this is the same kind of question, maybe it isn't. I'm thinking about stories, and in particular the stories maybe my patients tell when they come for help. And the stories are really all about their background, right? This is what happened to me, this is who I am, this is how I understand it, this is what it is. And it seems like the education that happens in that context is not maybe so much different than the education we come here to find. When I came here as a student, it was to read texts that opened to me that the way that I had told my background wasn't the only way there was to think about it, that I could tell myself differently in interaction with these texts, some of which were very other. Well, I grew up in a little farm town downstate. All of them were very other than the texts that I had grown up in, the stories that had been told to me and about me as a young person. And so I guess rather than background and foreground, I would say, are there better ways to tell the story of who I am and who I will be and what the human project or purpose is before God than the one that I was innately, given in the context of my family and the place I grew up, and that the texts can do that for us. I would call it an exchange more than a background and foreground. I think an exchange for the purpose of every now and then I'll say to a patient, so who told you that story about you? like, oh, I have some ability to move that, right? And what if I told you this one instead? And sometimes texts do that for me, I think. They tell me a different story instead. And then I have some more mobility in the way that I come to think about something.
Here's some of what I was trying to get at in thinking that through is the dynamic in the classroom of, okay, I'm going to use this because this isn't the dynamic that comes up in the classroom. My mother's grandparents were born in Sweden, so I'm very white, very Swedish in some ways. And if we were in a classroom and reading, a text by some Swedish author, no, it doesn't. That's why I'm using that example. If all I could say was I'm Swedish and I have this expert knowledge of this text, that means you're in that classroom depending on the Swede in the class to fill in for the rest of the class this expert background. And I think some of the dynamic that you want to create in the classroom is to allow folks to meet texts wherever they want to meet texts, and no one person being positioned by virtue of their physicality, cultural background as being the experts on that text and only being able to encounter something in that subject positionality. So on the Swedish example, which is not such a transparent example, that I would be able to encounter the text either as Swedish or for whatever other thing engaged me about the text. And I think that kind of dynamic of, you don't always want to have to lead with the physical, bodily basis of your existence in engaging class, and you don't want to assume that of your students either.
But not leading with it does not mean you don't acknowledge it.
Right, or that they might not choose to speak out of that as well and enrich conversation in particular ways. But I think your responsibility, partly as a faculty, is to ensure that folks can meet texts in a bunch of different ways, and you're not assuming that they're going to meet them in particular ways.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Yes. So it sounds simple initially, but on second thought, I think it becomes more complex. The statement was made, we need to learn how our body reads a situation, and then another statement was listen to what your body is saying. How is that modeled? How can we go about that process? Because, initially it sounds simple, but I think actually coming to that point where you can, it's more complex than what it initially appears. So do you mind speaking on that?
Yes. Sure, and I'll speak on it more to you in pastoral care class next year. But all the time, everywhere and all the time. Sometimes it's modeled for me. Well, no, I model it. Sometimes I don't realize I'm modeling it, but I guess by simply saying, at this moment. I think I maybe had a moment like that in colloquium not too long ago. At this moment, I feel confused about what's going on, or I feel torn about two conversations that I think we're having, right? And so, rather than think to myself, lab coat moment, I need to assert some sort of control over the situation and be on top. In that context, I'm more apt to say, I feel torn between two conversations. What's going on? Which conversation do we need to have? How can we have it? So for me, when I'm listening to what's in here, what I'm often going to hear is there's some conflict or some anxiety or some point of suffering out there, and I need to stop and acknowledge it. So I think if there's one like first thing I'd say, and then we'll talk about it next year in class, the first thing I'd say is stop. Stop the process, at least in your head, slow it down, and see what's going on here. My advisor, God rest his soul, that was his first kind of methodological move about anything, what's going on here, right? And sometimes I think a classroom is a great place to stop and at least in your head say, what's going on here? It may be the text of the lecture or the text of the text, but it may also be something happening in the room organically in response to that that's not registering in mouths yet. So slow down, stop, listen, what's going on. I don't mean to be mysterious. It really isn't once you start doing it mysterious.
I have a question related to Professor Stackert's remarks, but it's really for anybody who wants it. I suspect you've all been in this situation. I find very compelling, and I'm drawn to what you said about making the classroom a space for honesty, a place where students can have real exchange around real issues, especially given the sorts of things that we deal with in our classes. And of course, it's going to depend on the sorts of things we're studying. But I wonder about the situations where awkwardness in those conversations is related not only to squeamishness, but also to trauma. That on the one hand, maybe you're not running into students who are traumatized by circumcision, unless, I don't know, they're killed by their sister's friend.
There's the guy out in front of...
But then, then in the material you're dealing with, there's rape and there's murder and there's parental abuse and getting mauled by bears and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So the question's about where do you draw and how do you draw limits to openness? How do you balance honesty and safety?
Yeah. Maybe I'll say two things. One is, before I came here, I taught at the University of Minnesota, and there I taught really big classes. So like 175 students or something like that. And so reading course evals at the end of a semester was always a bit of a crapshoot. One student one time, and I have no idea what the context for this was, wrote on the evaluation, "This class helped me get over my rape." And I don't know what she was talking about. I presume it was a woman, but I don't even know that. But the handwriting was some idea. But like thinking back on what I did in that course, I don't think that I was attending to such issues specifically at all. The Hebrew Bible has lots of cases of rape. And so we talked about some of these, and we talked about gender politics, and we talked about socio-historical circumstances, and so that was a case where this came up, but I didn't know it, and yet I think what maybe Chris was saying earlier, this may not even be possible in certain cases, but knowing your students, being sensitive to body language, I teach very small courses here, almost without exception. And so, I have one student who is very expressive facially. And I will sometimes say to the student, it looks like there's something going on, based on the way that this person is like contorting their face looking at me. And I think some of this is about that sort of sensitivity in the classroom. Like in the example of University of Minnesota, I think there are times where you run into this and you don't know it. And so there again, maybe I would return to something I said in my opening comments, and that is, when you screw it up, apologize. You don't have to always deal with it the first time. You can deal with it the second time. Sometimes you'll never know. But I agree, it's a major issue, and it's something to really be aware of to the extent that you can.
We have time for about one more question.
I have a question. We have 2 female bodies and 1 male body up there. Does your gendered body make a difference in the front of the classroom? Pedagogy or interaction? Maybe the students should respond.
I was thinking when I first started teaching, and I was teaching at a Methodist seminary. I was 28. I was younger in some cases than everybody in my class. And we were team teaching, and I team taught with Tech Sample, who was the most popular professor in the school, and I was just starting, and he was tall and I was small and female, and I was very aware, and it wasn't just gender, of every time I went into the classroom, I had to earn my authority, and he was granted his. And I mean, that's partly an age, it's partly a size, it's partly a gender dynamic. I mean, it's all those things. And being the unknown versus the well-known. But I don't know, that's one example.
I think I definitely benefit from being male, in part because I'm young. I think.
And handsome?
Well,
here comes the bluff.
when I was in graduate school, I went to a Jewish university, and I didn't grow my beard initially because of classroom issues, but I certainly kept it because at my university there was a shopping period at the beginning of each term, and I taught classes in Hebrew language, for example, and I would have a majority of Orthodox Jewish students, and if they found out that I wasn't Jewish, some of them were going to drop the course, and so they would, I'd teach, say, in the fall, and somebody would say, what are you doing for Sukkot? I said, I'm going to visit my family. What are you doing? They were going to visit their family. So then, 6 or 8 weeks into the term, somebody comes to me and say, in a whisper, always, I found out you're not Jewish. And I say, yeah, I'm not Jewish. But by that point, I earned their respect, and then it became an advantage, because if I said something they didn't like, he's just a goy. And it was okay, So, yeah, I think, combating youth in front of a classroom is very much a body issue. And I think, I have a less difficult time with certain students, especially male students, than some of my women colleagues who are similarly young. It's unfair, but I think it's the case from stories that they've told me, for example. I've taught many of you. I'd love to hear if gender, you felt like inflected our classroom in any significant way.
passwords.
Was the question, tell me the question again. Was it about my gender making a difference in my teaching experience?
Does it have any difference? Not necessarily that it makes a difference, but does it have a difference?
Does it have a difference? Again, it's one of those are you breathing questions. I don't know where that doesn't make a difference, right? Maybe. I was ordained in 1982. The questions that were asked of me in my ordination exam were, what was I going to wear in the pulpit? And who was going to do the dishes and the laundry at home in my house while I was working? Not what is your Christology, not who do you think the Holy Spirit is, not what is that thing with the bread and the wine, none of that. It feels like everywhere that I show up, it's a gendered experience. And so I assume that it is in the classroom as well. I don't necessarily think that means it's a disadvantage. In fact, sometimes I think it's an advantage. It became an advantage to be a woman in ministry in a pastoral situation. That's not how the congregation first received me. They didn't receive it as an advantage, but it became one. So to me, that it's a hard question to differentiate as opposed to what? Not having gender? I don't know how to do that. So yeah, it makes a difference. That's not necessarily a death sentence.
So we're out of time. Stay put for just a minute because we have a bunch of announcements, but first please join me in helping to thank our wonderful. So Brandon Klein unfortunately couldn't be here, the Air Assistant for Pedagogical Initiatives, but he asked me to announce that on February 27th at 4:30 p.m. there's the winter quarter pastoral teaching seminar with Professor J.Z. Smith here in the common room. You can RSVP if you would like you to RSVP. I'm not sure of his email address, but you can find it if you'd like to attend that, and that will be in the common room. On Monday, February 25th, coming up pretty soon, the Theology Workshop and the Hebrew Bible Workshop will be joining forces to have a presentation on social patterns around female sexuality in Song of Songs and Proverbs with a student we'll call Kelly.
Stackert gave a great tea there. I'm sure everyone wants to come now.
That'll be a first-time collaboration with the Hebrew Bible Workshop. We're very excited. And another first-time collaboration with History of Religions on March 14th. Professor Wendy Doniger will be presenting on, let me see if I can get this right, the phallus of Shiva and prudishness in modern Hindu fundamentalism. So that will also be at 4:30 on Thursday, March 14th, right here. So thank you all very much. Oh, sorry, if you didn't sign in and you want credit for practical teaching on my computer, you can sign in right now. Do that.